Welcome to Into
You
Theology.
jerk.
My name is Wyatt Graham, and I'm joined by Ian Clary.
Happy friggin' New Year.
And I actually have food in my mouth because I'm eating pretzels. So this is a very good start time.
Yeah.
Happy New Year.
Yeah.
We're doing something a little bit different. Well, I guess it's now similar to what we've done in the past.
Yep.
We're going to do a few-week study on a biblical book, namely the book of Proverbs. We won't do the whole
So
book.
wise, we need to share our wisdom with everybody.
Well, see, I was under the impression that you're so foolish that we needed you to be wiser to
That's
improve the
right.
podcast, but
It's actually more accurate for sure.
that's more accurate. No, we're both in need of wisdom. Me more so, I'm sure. We're gonna do the first 9 chapters of Proverbs. They're kind of a self-contained unit, as it were, and it gives us, I don't know, just something manageable to tackle. So I think today we're just gonna kind of
We did this, was it a year ago or 2 years ago when we did Ecclesiastes and we did
and
Job.
Job,
So it just seems to make sense
right?
to wrap out with more wisdom literature.
Right. Maybe we'll do Lamentations next. Who knows?
Ooh, I thought we should do Psalms. We should do
Yeah, the Psalms. Well, we could finish
stuff.
Proverbs too, because and anyhow. So I think today we're going to talk maybe a little bit about just some general patterns that we saw, some cool verses, and maybe introduce wisdom literature in this podcast. So, Ian, did you have a verse that you thought was cool, or two that you wanted to read out loud?
That's
Could be anything.
Preamble, like just the first opening
Yep.
7 verses. That really it kind of sets the stage for the chapter 1, and really for the whole book. So, and we can even talk a little bit maybe about authorship and that kind of thing too. So Proverbs 1, the Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel. To know wisdom and instruction, to understand words of insight, to receive instruction in wise dealing, in righteousness, justice, and equity, to give prudence to the simple, knowledge and discretion to the youth. Let the wise hear and increase in learning, and the one who understands obtain guidance. To understand a proverb and a saying, the words of the wise and their riddles. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. So lays out the kind of like basic trajectory. Verse 7, obviously very famous verse, is something of like the motto of the whole text, really, that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, and setting out like the contrast between the wise and the fool. All that stuff's just kind of like baked right into these opening 7 verses. So what do you think? Is Solomon the guy that did it? How's that work?
I think that a lot of the Proverbs are his, but I don't think that he organized the Proverbs just simply because there's different collections already named in it, like Agar and so on later. Yeah, I think it's reasonable to say that they're his because it says so. I don't think he sat down and wrote the book of Proverbs. I think he probably had many, and then these were organized by someone else who thought they were useful and put them in a way to make them readable. I mean, the first 9 chapters are essentially a father's advice to a son.
Yeah.
Now it's unique because it's a kingly figure, as it were, but it's not unique in the sense of the wisdom's common, I think.
Yeah.
So the idea of having
wisdom, proverb type writing, they're usually very, very general and kind of like hard to tie into a particular region or person. So it is interesting here that it's mentioned right off the bat that these are Solomon and then he's the king of Israel. So it's really like localizing it for a particular people group.
It's localizing it for Israel.
Yeah. What I understand just from some of the reading that I've done, that it's ascribed to him. The vast majority of the Proverbs were probably his, usually maybe because you don't normally write down a proverb, it's probably given in speeches and things like that came to be collected that represented him. And but yeah, there's what is it? There's the wise. Is it the wise of Hezekiah? I think at a certain point that gets referenced.
Yeah. There's a group mentioned who organizes Proverbs. I can't remember where that is in the book. Is it chapter 30 or something?
Yeah.
The ones of Agar.
Yeah, there's Agar. There's Lemuel gets mentioned as well.
Good old Lemuel.
Yeah, and we don't really know who they are.
Yeah, there is that kind of language in the book. So.
And it's interesting. I know I didn't realize this, but it's you could probably correct me, but even with the Proverbs or with Psalms, I didn't realize that sometimes you get like a couple of Proverbs throughout the collection that are like exactly the same, like it's almost the
Right.
same
Oh yeah, like
verses.
doubles. Oh, I see. Yeah.
And so the argument, and this happens in Psalms too, is that there were these varying collections that had been put together, and so like a collection might have had this one verse in it, and then another collection might have had the same proverb, and then when they were put together, that's why you get some repetition. I don't know if that's true or not, but
Yeah, and I mean, you can do other things like you can look at ancient Near Eastern proverbs and see that the genre is very similar wisdom, and some people might say, well, isn't that an argument, for like a negative argument towards the Bible because it's borrowing wisdom? But
yeah,
it's partly silly because Proverbs itself gives a sort of twofold source of wisdom, namely from what we'd say revelation and from nature.
right,
And so it's actually proof of divine wisdom that other people can discern it.
sure,
Not that they can do it. I mean, one of the interesting things in Proverbs, I can't remember, I think it's in chapter 3 or 4, it says that the fool actually does not choose the fear of the Lord,
right.
but he kind of knows about it.
Well, I
Um,
think even when Lady Wisdom, calls out in the streets,
oh, it's actually 129 is what I was talking about.
oh yeah, right, yeah, because it says they hated knowledge and did not choose the fear of the
Right.
Lord, would have none of my counsel. So they there's a tacit choice that you have to be aware of your two options if you're
Right.
making.
And it is interesting. I mean, even if you look at chapter 2 and chapter 1, it's chapter 2, verse 1, it's my words, my commandments.
Yeah,
Earlier in chapter 1, I believe it was your mother's Torah and my instruction.
yeah,
And yet,
verse 8.
is that verse 8 here too? Okay. And yet you see in chapter 2 and verse 6, it's the Lord who gives wisdom. And I think this is because, I mean, God uses means as like a simple answer. Like parents are meant to teach their children wisdom. All wisdom has a source in God. And in particular, there is some indication that there's some Torah in the background, but it's also just life experience wisdom. And you know that, I mean, in part for various reasons, but because for example, I think it's in chapter 4. I'm just going to double check here. Yeah, chapter 4, verse 7. The beginning of wisdom is this: get wisdom. And then you find right after that, well, where do you get wisdom? Well, it says, look at the ant and be wise. Or sometime in that, chapter 6 and verse 6. So you want wisdom? Look at the ant. So, the Belgic Confession lays out two sources of truth: the book of Scripture and the book of nature. And you sort of have a similar idea here, where wisdom is because there's one God. Wisdom encompasses everything that he's made, whether that's the word as creature, meaning the Bible, or nature as creature, meaning the universe around you.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and the concept drawn from the Belgic Confession goes right back through to like Augustine, who
Right.
speaks like in book language. I was just reading in Bonaventure. I was reading his soul's journey into God, and I think he makes the same sort of like distinction, calling them two books, which was kind of cool.
Yeah, well,
It's
it's an
funny,
ancient.
go ahead.
Well, it's
Yeah,
just
go
an
ahead.
ancient distinction. I mean,
Right.
the interesting part. So that's funny. I was reading. Was it this weekend? I think so. This source book on Chinese philosophy.
What?
Yes. In fact,
You've been hanging out with our friend Bayu too much, and he's getting
it
really
was literally a book called A Source Book in Chinese Philosophy.
wow.
So it was not a very profound title, but it is what it is. But one thing you read in here, what they say is what people in the West also say.
Right.
Natural law, an order to the cosmos. Some people believe in something like God. The concept of Tao, which C.S. Lewis used, is very similar to natural law. All of this is just evidence that there is a God because he ordered everything. I mean, Isaiah 28 says, it talks about the farmer farming, and then the end that says the Lord teaches the farmer. You're like, well, how did he teach the farmer? And it wasn't Second Farmers 22:29. It was nature. Nature teaches. So you see that throughout this book, and that's why it's. I think that's also why the genre is in generalization. So you can train up a child in the way that he shall go, and he will not depart from it. But sometimes they do. Or it says, if you fear the Lord, you're going to have material blessings. And that's often true because you live a wise life and you don't make foolish decisions to lose your money by gambling or something like that, or destroy your family by having an affair. But that's not always the case. I mean, the book of Job is also in scripture.
Right. Right.
So I think that kind of helps you to read Proverbs by knowing there's a general common sense that Proverbs has, common because everybody has access to it, sense because it's accessible to the senses, and that is also divine wisdom. But it is less clear, I think, as a Belgic confession says, than like scriptural or divine direct revelation, which is much more clear and articulates things at a level that you maybe could not know from nature.
It's interesting too. I mean, when wisdom is laughing, verse 26 of chapter one, I also will laugh at your calamity. I will mock when terror strikes you. When terror strikes you like a storm, and your calamity comes like a whirlwind, when distress and anguish come upon you. Interesting because, like, right before that, if you turn at wisdom's reproof, then wisdom pours out spirit upon you and makes her words known to you, right? So that's active on the part. If you do this, then I will give you this. But then the laughing at calamity and the mockery at terror doesn't seem like I'm going to terrorize you and then laugh at you. It's like, oh, you're going to make foolish decisions. Terror will come upon you as a result. And it's like, I'm going to say, look, man, I told you, if you turned to me, this wouldn't have happened. And so
Uh,
it's like playing out the consequences of failing to heed wisdom will play itself out naturally.
yeah, I think you see that actually throughout. I mean, one of the interesting things that Proverbs does is it tells you if you live a righteous life, you'll live a healthier life, and if you live an unrighteous life, you'll suffer. Like it's really interesting. Like at Proverbs 3:8 or 3:7 and 8 it says, "Be not wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord, which is the beginning of wisdom, and turn away from evil." And as a consequence, verse 8 says, "It will be a healing to your flesh." The word there is actually navel, to your stomach, and a refreshment to your bones. Well, or a medicine to your bones, literally, I think. And or another alternative. So think about healing to your stomach or navel. It's like if whenever you do something wrong, you feel guilt, you feel anxiety, you feel less pressure. Well, there is a sort of natural harm that happens through doing evil. And the healing to your bones, I think, is also important. That there's something, your whole person is tied together. And when there's a lot of natural consequences in life. In fact, the woman, I can't remember if we're in chapter whatever, 4, 5, or 6, or 7, or 8, or 9, but there's a woman there is enticing. I think it's actually chapter 3 at this point. And it says her speech is like honey. But in fact, when you embrace her, like as an adulterer,
Yeah,
it
it's chapter
becomes
5.
wormwood.
Yeah.
Bitter, it's a poison. And that poison harms you. So sin is self-harm, and righteousness is the opposite of self-harm, is building yourself up. It's helping you. But everyone knows it's not just, this isn't just like prosperity gospel stuff. This is just real life. Because you gotta remember the context. The genre is common sense. So like if you are faithful to your wife and do your job well, you'll probably have a paycheck, and your life will be stable. Right? That's everyone knows that. That's divine wisdom, but it's also just generally true. There are exceptions that you can't control. I get that. But this isn't prosperity gospel because it's not like God saying it's 100% that you'll have like 1,000 cows on a hill if you just pray on Tuesday. The point is, like, if you live this way, it's actually better for you. You have a better life. You think about the billions of dollars spent on self-help in the self-help industry and gurus and life coaches. And the answer is they actually produce value off sometimes, because if you live a wiser life, you have a better quality of life. And if you live a foolish life, you live a life of suffering often. And wisdom, rightly, as you noted in verse 26 of chapter 1, I think, mocks you, laughs at you. You make a mockery of wisdom, well, it will return upon your head. And I think a lot of probably younger men in particular, younger people, know this. Older too, but I think usually make more mistakes earlier in life so that you can see it. I mean, you could probably think about just like excess drug abuse, which will wreck your body.
It's funny, like thinking about that because back in the day right before I got saved, right? So I was saved in August of, I think, 96. And right before that, the May 24 weekend, so Victoria holiday in Canada,
Right?
I got a party with all my friends. I mean, just went on a bender, camping, the whole deal. And I can remember sitting in my mom's living room staring at her kitchen, or sorry, I was sitting in her kitchen staring at the floor, and there was an ant that like went across the floor, and I'm looking at it and totally burned out from the week. Like I could barely move. And I'm looking at this ant, and it's funny because whenever I read Proverbs and I read about the ant, I always think of this because the ant was like this weird rebuke to me. Like it was like, oh, he has purpose. Like, look at him. My mom's not got a huge kitchen, but relative to him, it was like he was crossing the Sahara Desert. Doing something for his colony or whatever. And I just remember thinking, my life is utterly purposeless right now. And I from that, like, that's May 24. May 31st was my birthday. It was the last time I did any kind of like illegal substance. And then by August, I was saved. Like, it's crazy. And like, it's funny how nature and those sorts of things, right? Just the way it works can really have an impact on you, and can alter the course of
Yeah.
your life.
It also frees you up to say that ant was, in a sense, from God, not like in like some weird mystical sense,
Yeah,
but
it's just
in
providence.
providence.
Yeah,
That's why the ant is there for you to get wisdom.
yeah.
I think in a different set, I had a similar circumstance when I was a teenager. Is like you kind of do the parties and drinking, but I just found like it was making me so unhealthy, and I enjoyed athleticism that it was unwise because it wrecked my body. And this is before I was necessarily like a dedicated Christian, where I wouldn't do that because it's
Oh,
wrong.
I can remember back in the day being
Yeah,
in a prayer meeting with your sister and her husband, and she's like, "You gotta pray for my brother Wyatt." And so, I mean, like, before I even knew who you were,
yeah.
I was praying for you.
That's funny that you prayed for me before I knew you. That's a
Yeah,
weird thought, actually.
it
That
is a
just
weird
struck
thought.
me.
Yeah,
Which probably happens all the time in a sense. I never
it
thought about
does.
that before, and just,
Yeah.
but man, that's all providence. And I also just think spirituality sometimes is more simple than we think. Like your aunt or my observation from athleticism was a way that God was talking to us. It wasn't salvific. Well, those events alone were not salvific. You need the gospel. That's not my point. But God, I think, can talk. I mean, this is the whole thing. Like, I'll just give you one example. Ahab, and second, Ahab is like the middle of kings. He's bad news. Him and Jezebel unite the southern and northern kingdoms under Baal. He kills the prophets with Jezebel, or she does in particular, but he assassinates Naboth. And then, he gets threatened, and he's like, "Oh, I'm so sorry for doing that," and God relents. You know, there's just this weird, but he wasn't. But then he continued to do evil, just evil after that.
Yeah.
So he wasn't in the way that we think of it saved, but God relented.
Yeah.
And so I think there's a lot of times that God works with us in ways that are not directly salvific in the way that we think of it as evangelicals, but are true and real. I mean, Solomon's a great example. This guy right here, 1 Kings 3. The description of his reign is he followed David, except he did not get rid of the high places. Next verses, he goes to Gibeon, the highest place of all, and sacrifices to Yahweh. And guess what happens? Yahweh says, "Thank you for the sacrifice. What do you want from me because you're a righteous man?" And he says, "I want wisdom."
Yeah, weird. Yeah, it's funny when you think of it that way. Wow.
Yeah, so and that's the famous wisdom story. He does what is wrong in God's eyes, and God still says yes. And you see it throughout Kings and Chronicles. The whole story, in my opinion, is God is so merciful that he seems unjust.
Yeah.
It's
Wow.
weird.
Like, it's gratuitous that he's
It's gratuitous. You
wow.
have Kings is over like 400 years, and you have one Jehu. But also you have Ahab, who for decades with Jezebel annihilates the prophets and worships Baal, and nothing happens. And Jehu's delayed because Ahab is a temporary sorry. It'd be like if Vladimir Putin, after this war ends, was like, "Sorry, guys," and the world was like, no big deal. Like that's a weird part of it, but God's mercy is so gratuitous that he seems unjust, which is why I think in Romans 3, Paul says that God passed over sins previously, so that at the cross he could be both just um, by satisfying justice in Christ, and the justifier by showing mercy in light of this. And so the cross actually explains why God seems unjust in Kings and Chronicles.
Wow, that's cool. That's super helpful, man. I like it.
Um,
Um,
I have
I was
to
gonna
go in like
say,
2 minutes, so give a
okay,
really
well, I
wise
was
thought
just
to
gonna make
end.
like a final kind of more philosophy point. But back to what we were before, it's like, oh, like when you just kind of like get yourself, get yourself in order, like Jordan Peterson would say, make your bed or whatever. But when you're doing those sort of basic things, you're kind of aligning yourself with just reality. You do flourish, right? And pagan philosophers can see this. You think of like Aristotle's whole concept of eudaimonia. It's like you just kind of like orient yourself to reality and live in the flow of it instead of cutting against the way God, as we would say it, has made things. Then the natural just progression, the way God's made the universe and reality to function, is that you'll just prosper. It's not absolute, and there's going to be other things that could happen, but generally speaking, you're gonna flourish, and that's what it's about. Now here, obviously, it's flourishing under God Himself, so it's not just like a generic concept of you.
No, Proverbs it's a plus.
Yeah, yeah.
But it's not. It doesn't minimize, I think, the general sense of human flourishing. Meaning, if you're a son who's wise, and you enjoy your own fountains, meaning your own wife of your youth,
Yeah.
and not others, your life will be much more satisfying. You probably know people who've split up or divorced or whatever. It's very stressful. It's financially ruinsome, and you probably lose with the legal proceedings 2 to 3 years of your life.
Yeah.
Which is huge.
And then your kids are destroyed.
And your kids are affected often. Yeah. I mean, there's ways to do it. I think that's better and worse, but I agree. Like it's never as good as a healthy marriage, but the thing is, like, you have to actually care about that as a Christian, and not just say, well, all I care about is someone getting saved. It's like, yeah, but you want them to live a good life and be saved. Like, of course they're going to. I mean, Job is an example of a good life despite his suffering. It doesn't mean that you will avoid all suffering. But it does mean that you'll, generally speaking, live a wise life where wisdom doesn't mock you, as you read, but wisdom actually rewards you. And that's the way God created the cosmos. It makes sense. That's why a farmer can learn from farming, or an ant can teach us to work hard, or in your case, to have purpose. So, all right, friend, I gotta go. I'm gonna go jump into the snow, and then I gotta go teach a class.
There's a lot of wisdom in that one, I'm sure.
I literally am about. Anyways, we'll explain offline. Okay, bye, friends.